Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. For those of you who I've not met, I am Rabbi Gabriel from Brighton and Hove Progressive Synagogue. That's also who I am if you have met me, but there we go. And it is really nice to be able to be with you all tonight. It's like the good old days of lockdown when we could have liberal communities gathered together on Zoom, and it's really nice to see so many faces. Teaching a whole chapter of Pirkei Avot in an hour, I decided was a challenge I was not willing to take on. So in fact, we're going to look at one line of the chapter in Pirkei Avot, but we're going to look at it in very considerable detail, and we're going to look at some of the commentaries on it, because it is a strange and perplexing line with many different attributes to it. So I'm going to begin by showing us the particular line that I've chosen. It is from chapter 4, this being the fourth week of the Omer, and this is from Mishnah 20, and it reads as follows. Elisha ben Abuya says, one who learns in their childhood, to what are they compared? To ink written on new parchment. And one who learns in old age, to what are they compared? To ink written onto scrubbed parchment. So, that's what we've got. That's the line. You could just leave now, but I think there's probably more we can squeeze out of this. So just instinctively, having read that, what is the first thing that comes into your head of what's being said here? What is the meaning, the subtext, the purpose? Someone unmute yourselves and call out.
Old people have learned many, many things, some of which have been rubbed out, some of which have been written over. So the new knowledge is landing on a mound of past knowledge, whereas one who learns in their childhood has a fresh, clean piece of parchment on which you can start writing. That's what it says to me.
Okay, so the idea that when an older person is learning, they might be almost overwriting old material, or at least adding to old material, because they're not coming to anything completely fresh anymore. Really interesting. Anybody else?
Sorry, you go ahead.
Sorry, yeah. Is it perhaps the wisdom that you gain as you get older, that what's important isn't to compare yourself to other people, but to judge yourself, or for others to judge you by the standards you have attained, what you've done, rather than comparing yourself to other people?
All right, so you picked up that you picked up that the comparison isn't to different sorts of people, but rather the people are being compared to something more objective in some ways. Absolutely. Linda, you were going to say something.
To me, it says that it's really easy to learn when you're a child and really difficult to learn when you're a grown-up.
All right, so recognizing that the adult brain, I don't think it's even about old age, but just about adulthood almost, is much less supple than the young brain. Learning Hebrew or any other language as an adult is much harder than learning as a child. That is definitely something that people find with their own life experience. Now, a slightly different way of questioning this is this passage flattering or unflattering to old people or young people? Does this yearn people to learn in old age? Does it make you yearn to learn in young age? Does it make you look forward, look backwards? Who comes off well out of this comparison, do we think?
I think you can see it in two ways. So obviously for one who is looking at new parchment, it's very clear what the learning is and the ink is. So to read on scrub parchment isn't easy, but on the other hand, to me, it means that they've got no context for it. There it is, that's what they've learned. Whereas once you're older, it's seen against a background of all the other things that you've heard and learned, and you can put it into against your life experience.
All right, that's really interesting. So almost the idea that when you write something on a completely new blank clean sheet of paper, it's going to be a very, very faithful representation of what you wrote onto it. And that can be for better or for worse. It can be good because of the absolute clarity, but it can be bad because nothing really belongs in isolation like that. Certainly not in the field of learning Judaism, and everything needs some sort of coloring around it. Really interesting. Okay, Pete and then AC.
So there's a part of the actual process itself, the writing on parchment usually was done on vellum, which is a skin, and you actually have to take something away in order to be able to rewrite. You're actually damaging and removing part of the service, and old documents tend to be quite fragile if you're having to take away what was there and then put something new on top. You can't put more parchment down. And I just see it as a process of, we learn through our mistakes, we learn through the things that we get wrong and that we have to remove from our lives, but that leaves us in a more, not necessarily vulnerable place, but it's a much more intense process. It has to be an intentional process to remove the old and then put the new in.
All right, thank you. And you've particularly brought up the idea of mistakes, which you hadn't mentioned yet. And of course, what might be being removed is not old knowledge, but might be actually mistakes. It might be a deliberate process of moving on rather than a unfortunate process of overwriting in some ways. Okay, I'm following along the raised hands in my row. AC, you are next, and then John.
I don't know what it's like writing on new parchment, but thinking it was an analogy, it's not a proven surface, and also thinking literally, you can misunderstand things when you're learning as a child because you don't have all that context. So maybe writing on new parchment isn't ideal, whereas with a scrubbed parchment, it's a proven. It's matured, it's aged. Maybe the writing in a figurative way is going to be easier or more durable, but in metaphorical way, well, you've got so much more context. You're less likely to perhaps to jump to the wrong conclusion. You're going to have a more considered interpretation of what you're being taught.
All right, yeah, really interesting, thank you. So we're going to have John, Norman, Fiona, and then we're going to move on to our first commentary.
I was just going to say that the ink is the same, the parchment is different. And one of the things that occurs to me, as well as all the other things people have said, is that the parchment is the recipient of the learning. And so maybe it depends on the recipient. The body of knowledge might be the same, but once it's transmitted, it depends on the person who receives it.
All right, absolutely. And that's certainly important in understanding the sort of Chinese whispers effect that you have with any sort of oral tradition, which of course this is. Ironically, it's talking about ink, but it was an orally transmitted document for many, 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 many years, many, many decades at least. Norman and Fiona.
I want it to be favourable to learning in old age because I'm in it, and I kind of agreed with what AC said, but I'm a little suspicious of this, that it could mean, or it could be seen to mean, learn while the parchment is fresh and new. In other words, it's better to learn Torah, if you like, from an early age. I don't know. I don't want it to mean that, but I think it could be interpreted as that.
All right, and that's definitely something we're going to be exploring, how it was understood in that sense. So thank you for that. And finally, Fiona.
Right, sorry about that. Mostly to echo what Norman says, I was looking at it from the teacher's point of view as an ex-teacher. Yeah, it's much easier to learn in your childhood than in your old age.
All right, thank you. So we're going to delve in now and see how it's been understood in different time periods. So we're going to start with a commentary from the 19th century. Is there somebody who would like to read this out in the English just to give you variance from my voice? Go for it, Norman.
This passage highlights two particular benefits of learning in one's childhood. Firstly, they are like white parchment. Every single line makes an impression on them. They will grasp even subtle ideas quickly. Secondly, new parchment is not smeared with previous writing, so even when the ink dries, what is written will remain legible. Conversely, when a piece of parchment begins to lose its structure, thin lines will not show up on it. Similarly, the older person has no ability to acquire and retain information.
So this is quite a hostile text to your point of view and what you were looking for, Norman. And I'm not including it because I agree with it, but I'm including it because we want to see how it's been understood. This is definitely in favor of people learning in their youth. And what's his real reasons why people should learn in their youth? Like, we can imagine why, as a teacher of Torah, he'd want that, because that was his business. He wanted to fill his Beit Midrash with young students. But what's the reasons that he's giving here?
They learn quickly. Children learn quickly, and every single line, it makes an impression on them, because it's all legible.
And it's that idea of every single line that is really interesting. So we talk about thin lines, the minutiae, the subtleties. This is, he's suggesting almost as an older person, you'll be able to get the alphabet maybe, but in terms of working out which of those vowels, is it the one with the line or the one with the t-shirt, is going to be much more difficult. And of course, to some extent, that is borne out by people's life experience. It is more difficult to learn subtleties the older one gets. This is certainly, I'm beginning to find this now that I'm no longer able to call myself a child. Someone had a hand up and then took it down again. Feel free to come back.
It was me.
Yeah.
I was just thinking it's like that Jesuit thing, give me a child up to the age of 7.
Tell us more about that for those who aren't familiar with it.
The Jesuits were a teaching order, and they saw the importance of getting a child when it's young and malleable to and open to ideas.
Thank you. And of course, that idea actually has been imported into liberal Jewish practice to some extent, not from the Jesuits, but that idea. So a child whose parent or parents convert to Judaism through LJ, if they're under the age of 7, they're included in the conversion. And if they're over the age of 7, then there's an extra step for them to complete through bar or bat mitzvah. And the idea is that, again, when they're under the age of 7, they're going to absorb Judaism from the environment around them much more strongly, whereas the older they become, the more they're going to have their own ideas, the more their parchment becomes scrubbed, if we're going to use it in that sense. John, you have a hand up.
No, I think it was just me drinking some orange juice.
I meant the other John, actually.
Oh, sorry, I apologise.
That's all right.
Sorry, I was muted. I'm just not quite sure what you mean by not being able to grasp things subtly when you're older. I mean, my own experience is that, perhaps because I did a degree in philosophy quite late in life. I feel like my mind's more open than it was when I was younger. When I was younger, I really wanted to stick with the beliefs that I had, and I certainly wasn't interested in questioning the beliefs that I had. And I think the older I get, the more I question everything, really. Not necessarily authority, but just my own beliefs.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. Of course, what you're highlighting really well is that the Tiferet Yisrael is using a massive generalization here. An older person has no ability to acquire and attain information is not really an appropriate thing to say, aside from anything else. And I think what he's alluding to is the fact that the human brain does become slightly less able to assimilate new ideas, particularly in languages. I know research has shown that, but in other areas as well, it does become more difficult. So when I first started teaching adult Hebrew courses, I, as someone who learnt Hebrew as a child, found it impossible to understand how somebody can look at two totally different looking letters and confuse them. I thought to myself, I can understand confusing two letters that look a bit similar, but how can someone constantly read a mem as a resh or vice versa? And to help myself understand that, I taught myself shorthand from a 1920s book, because I thought that was the best equivalent I could find to learn something new as an adult. And now I get it. And the answer is, we're all thick. Something happens about the age of 18 or so when it just becomes difficult. And I don't know what it is. I'm sure if I had a psychology degree, I'd have an idea of what it is. But things do just become more difficult. Someone has a hand up here. Carolyn, you have a hand up. You're on mute, however, so we're missing out on your wisdom.
Sorry. I have a psychology degree, so I'll give you that perspective.
Excellent.
I find it's difficult to learn new things, languages, yes, but I find that I'm combining things much better, and I'm getting a lot more creative as I go, that I have building blocks that I can play with. And I mean, now I understand why people say old people are wise. A lot of times I see connections which younger people, I work with younger people, go, oh, okay. And if you show them that, they'll see it, but they would never have gotten it on their own. And I think that's one of the advantages of being old, and it's two different phenomena. So
Thank you. That's really helpful. And that's an idea we're going to come back to, actually. All right, we're going to take Norman, David, and Dr. J, and then we're going to continue.
I think what you're referring to, or what we're talking about, is something which is referred to brain plasticity, which is acknowledged to be, I mean, plastic, not plastic in the sense of, I don't know, a plastic knife or fork, but like plasticine. It's malleable, it's squashable, it's stretchable. And if you leave plasticine out, it goes, the older it gets, the harder it is to work. I think that's the metaphor that we're talking about.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And no doubt if the Pirkei and Avot had been written at a time when plasticine was known, that may well have been the analogy that they'd used instead of the parchment. Yes, David, go ahead.
Yeah, it just occurred to me that experience plays a part. So when you're older, you have experiences that maybe a younger person wouldn't have. So just because I was talking about this recently, you know, I'm just turned 60 and I lived through the era of the 3-day week and the hard left and British Leyland and all that sort of thing. And so that has probably definitely has coloured my views on certain things in society and in politics and so on. And whereas younger people who didn't live through that won't have that coloured. It's not a good thing or a bad thing, but it's just how as you get older, your previous experiences might make you a bit more less willing to be open to different points of view because you're coloured by those experiences, and you know they may no longer be appropriate, but they're in your past.
All right, thank you. So that's a really interesting counterpoint to the idea of having more experiences enabling you to make more connections. More experience can actually lay down railroad tracks almost on which the mind is more inclined to go along. Thank you. And Dr. J, I'm sorry, I don't have a full name for you. Go ahead.
Sorry, it's Juan Vergels. Sorry, I tried to do a video. I don't know if it will work because I was having a little bit of trouble with the connection. But yes, I don't know. I was thinking there are like very interesting points of view. I think the passage is a little bit dismissive of older people, probably. I guess, you know, I see the interesting point, you know, it makes, but it comes to my mind the example of Rabbi Akiva. I don't know if maybe someone mentioned it. Well, apparently, according to the tradition, he started to study Torah at 40 years old, and he became one of the greatest scholars ever in Judaism. So I guess, you know, that probably means that really is not up maybe to the age, but maybe to the student in the end.
Thank you. That's a really important point. And the existence of Rabbi Akiva, not to mention all, like many people in the Zoom call, by the way, as people who are actively learning Judaism beyond childhood, is why I want to find a way that isn't relying on this first commentary we've just read. This first commentary we've just read is unflattering and unfair, I think. And so we're going to move beyond it. Let's have a look at the second one down. This is slightly earlier commentary. This is 17th century. Is there someone who would like to read this one? Go for it, Ronnie.
An older person's mind is already engraved with many worldly thoughts and concerns, When they want to learn words of Torah, they first need to erase those worldly thoughts, and it is impossible to do this completely.
Thank you. So this is maybe a little bit like what David alluded to with the idea that one's own experiences color our thinking. What I want to ask is, they first need to erase worldly thoughts. Do we need to erase worldly thoughts in order to learn Torah? Go on, Linda, then Fiona.
To some extent, you need to erase worldly thoughts in order to do any learning, because you need to stop worrying about doing the meal plan and doing the cleaning and the tidying and, oh no, the in-laws are coming. Like you just need to put yourself in a totally different space. And when you're a kid, you don't have any of those worries. So I mean, that's why I think it's harder to learn anything as an adult. You've just got things to worry about.
Okay, so it's almost an idea of bandwidth, almost, that your mind is occupied with other things that are going on in your life. Really interesting. Fiona.
I find this really quite a surprise, because I always think of Judaism as such a down-to-earth, practical religion. And it's telling you all about how to live in the everyday world, rather than something airy-fairy and purely theological and, yeah, just the, you know, the world of the spirit. We're everything, aren't we? We're practical and spiritual at the same time. So that's what I was thinking. I was surprised.
Yeah, and I think I shared your surprise. And I'm going to move us straight on to the next text, which is making the same point, but in a very different way. This next text is earlier still. This is from a commentator called Abarbanel, who is a Spanish commentator. You may have heard of him because he wrote a very well-known Torah commentary as well. This is from his commentary on Pirkei Avot. Is there someone who would like to read this one for us? You don't have to be from Nottingham, even though the first two readers have been.
Okay.
Go for it.
The elder's mind consists of a mixture of things like parchment that has been overwritten. In such case, it is impossible that there will not be remnants of the first letter's writing mixed up with the second letter's writing.
Thank you. What's the difference between those two commentaries that we just read? They're very, very similar in lots of ways, but I think there's a thin line that separates them, and I think it is a very significant one.
Well, the first one talks about erasing the thoughts that are already there. The second one acknowledges that the thoughts are there and they will get sort of blended in with the new thoughts.
All right, so absolutely. The second one isn't even raising the prospect of erasing our previous lives because it knows that that's not really possible or not really practical. But slightly more than that, I think it's taking at least a neutral stance about it. So the Tosafot Yom Tov in the middle is saying it's better to learn when you're young because an old person needs to erase worldly thoughts. That's impossible, therefore they can't learn properly. Whereas Nachalat Avot at the bottom of the page is not saying that. Nachalat Avot is saying it's not possible for an older person to learn without bringing in their worldly thoughts and experiences, but he's not saying that's a bad thing. And so I think this is a little bit close to something that maybe wouldn't have surprised you, Linda, in terms of saying, actually, Judaism is what happens when we combine the text that we have with our life experiences. And it's not necessary, it's not possible, and it's maybe not desirable to try and draw that line to separate them, because actually we can only understand what we have with that level of context, with that level of understanding. Yes, Ronnie.
I'm just actually astonished at all of the negative stuff about older learning, because I remember hearing from my mother, who was descended from a long line of rabbis, including the Tosafot Yom Tov, supposedly, that you had to be over a certain age to study certain parts of Jewish learning. You couldn't be under the age of 40. That was the figure, because you didn't have the understanding that was required. And here are people saying just the opposite. so I'm baffled. Even the neutral one is a little bit negative. There'll be remnants of mixed up, you know, it's not making a virtue of this, but it's something that has to be overcome. So, you know, I'm baffled, really.
That's really interesting. So, I mean, unfortunately, you should never be baffled by Jewish texts disagreeing with other Jewish texts. That is the one thing that should always be expected. But you're right. There is certainly some sort of inconsistency here. I think I may be reading that final one, the Nachalat Avot, on the page less critically than you are. And I think the idea of being mixed up, it's not necessarily a bad thing. When you talk about learning and we say mixed up, I suppose it does sound like a criticism, but that's my translation. But rather, things that are being blended together, blending experiences, is maybe a more positive spin that we could equally have used to do the translation. Linda and then Pete.
I'm just going to make the point that they, like all of these commentators, need to impress on us the importance of educating our young specifically, because then you're preparing them for their entire lives. So, I mean, we none of us are going to deny that it's vital to educate the young, and it always has been and always will be. So, you know, they're backing up fairly sensible and universal ideas here.
Yeah, and that's a really good point about where they were writing from. So in the same way that the principal of Leo Beck College is never going to say, you don't really need rabbis, lay leaders and lay educators are wonderful. Of course, that's true, but she wants people to go and train to be rabbis, quite rightly. And so people come from different approaches. And it's absolutely right that all of these commentators wanted to educate the young. And so extolling the virtues of educating the young was definitely something they were going to do. Pete, please.
Just to point out that when we're talking about the elderly mind, we need to look at the dates, because an elderly person in 1437 would have only been about 40, 45. Yeah. Whereas someone in 1860, you're looking at about 60 to 70. And today, of course, we're looking at 90, 100. The concept of youth as well. When did a child become old enough to work and support the family? Again, changes. So it kind of takes the sting out when you read this idea of an older person is no longer has the ability, because someone in 1860, if they'd reached 70, 80, they were probably fairly well damaged by the life they'd lived in order to survive.
Thank you. And that's really important. That's really important as well. And of course, it's also difficult to know how these commentators whether the commentators were writing about old age in their own time or writing about old age as would have existed at the time of the text they were commenting on. Because they were all commenting on a 2nd century text, but were they understanding it through the prism of the old people, if we're going to define old people in any meaningful way around them, or were they trying to imagine back? It's a really, really good point. Fiona, yeah.
Like Pete, I'm going to be a bit historical now.
Yeah.
And this might be a total red herring, but I was just thinking that writing materials in the past were not as cheap and easy to come by as they are now. And so it was quite common with things like parchment and paper. If you received a letter, you could read it and then you turn it through 90 degrees and write over it. And it sounds like a mess, but it actually isn't. You can follow it quite easily. And I was then thinking of Talmud, which is a mixture of generations of people's learning, all put together like a pub conversation with everybody chipping in. And so from that point of view, rather than being denigrating to the elders' minds, it's actually saying the opposite, I would have thought.
All right, thank you. They're both really interesting observations. Yeah. Dr. J, and then we are going to move on.
Yes, sorry. Yeah, it came to my mind two things to say probably. The first one was why the interest that they have apparently with the childhood and the children, right? And well, I guess it comes to my mind this in Chile, one of the proverbs where it says that to show the child a path to which well, he probably says will stick, you know, like later in life, and from there never will depart, right? So I think that is something important to consider. And the second one about the age is interesting to remember. One of them is more, one of the Tehillim, maybe the 90, maybe what refers that maybe the years of a man is something like 70 with luck 80. So, and that probably is a very old text. So I guess it's really difficult to maybe generalize, but who knows? Yeah.
Thank you. And I also see that Frank has put in the chat that the young learn without question, older people with interpretation. And it's important to recognize then as well that we are actually talking about learning as if it means one thing. And of course, learning doesn't mean one thing. And so learning without interpretation, learning by rote, is something which maybe in the Jewish context that these commentators were writing in, the sort of traditional Eastern European Beit Midrash, they would have wanted the young people to learn by rote and memorize exactly what their teachers were telling us. Whereas perhaps today we want our children much more to bring interpretation and life experience. What goes on in the Cheder at Northwood and Pinner Liberal Synagogue is not at all like what would have gone on in the Beit Midrash for children of their own age, of the same age, taught by the Tosafot Yom Tov or taught by the Tiferet Yisrael. And actually, so much of modern Jewish education is about encouraging young people to bring their own life experiences, not to scrape off their life experiences from their parchment, but rather to integrate those two sides of their life. We're going to go on a little bit now. We've got two more commentaries on this page. We're skipping around through time yet again, but why not? So the first one is a 17th century, like 16th, 17th century commentary. And this one is about the nature of teaching and the nature of education altogether. Is there someone who would like to read this? Please, Monique.
A teacher does not actually give a student wisdom itself. We can compare this to one who shows a stranger a painting on a wall. Even though the stranger absorbs the image of the painting into their imagination, we still would not say that the one who showed them the painting actually engraved its image into the recipient's memory. Likewise, one who teaches Torah to another is not considered as if they actually engrave by their own strength teachings into the mind of their pupil. Rather, the pupil engraves themselves.
Thank you. So what is this adding to things?
Maybe a sense that teachers shouldn't beat themselves up if the students don't take it all in.
Okay, so first of all, absolutely, from the teaching point of view, it's a partnership, and it's not necessarily a failing on the part of the teacher if it doesn't work, so to speak. Fiona and Norman.
When you look at a painting, the painting, it stands on its own, and when you observe it, you're bringing to it your life and seeing it through that filter. And it's the same with Torah. Torah stands on its own, and in every generation we reinterpret it through our own filter of our experience, and it's our society.
Absolutely. And so this is maybe the Derech Chaim suggesting that there is no blank parchment. The child's parchment may be blanker, may have less on it, may be less creased, but actually everyone is always filtering what is coming through into their mind through, as you say, like their own eyes, their own prism. Norman.
Yeah, it really the last two respondents have said what I was going to say. Learning is in the brain of the learner, and I think this to me speaks of the role of teacher as facilitator, providing the right atmosphere and experience in which to learn, and thereby the pupil engraves themselves. I love that phrase
Yeah. And we're actually almost understanding the transmission of Torah is not something that results in a mirror image simply being produced each time. And that, of course, is a very realistic acknowledgement. As we've said, the Talmud is a conversation across ages. And even the Mishnah, it's, you know, that text we started with, Elisha ben Abuya said, did he say it? What precise words did he use? Who did he say it to? Have those words been changed as it's been handed down to us over time? We don't know any of that. But actually what's happened is someone has heard it from their teacher and engraved it on their memory, and then in due course they've told it to someone else. And hopefully later this week, when you all tell all of your friends at Kiddush how wonderful this session was, you'll very slightly misremember something and you'll tell it in your own words as well. And that's absolutely right and proper and realistic. And it's an understanding that therefore what we want is that there's going to be those slight changes. Otherwise, the Torah we're learning is going to be exactly the same as the Torah that was being taught thousands of years ago. And then there's been no development. There's been no change. We'd be living the same lives as our ancestors. And that's not something that Jews do. For all the protestation about tradition, actually, there always is going to be change. There always is going to be a little bit of development. Let's move on to the second one on this page. Would someone like to read this one out? Please, John, you read it, and I'm going to turn the light on in the room where I am.
The Torah is compared to ink. When someone learns Torah, it is as if they are writing on new parchment. Similarly, their ink is like a golem, without form, until they write with it on parchment, and then the golem assumes a form.
All right, thank you. So this text is really messing with the Mishnah, and this is suggesting actually that everyone is almost writing on new parchment, and that everything is new, because the Torah, as we've said, is something that they are creating with. It's clay almost. We're really mixing our artistic metaphors here, but it's clay that they're forming into their own understanding of Torah. How does this fit with the age dynamic? Because it's a commentary on exactly the text that we're dealing with. So age must fit into it somewhere. How do we understand that as working?
This is making a distinction now between the ink and the parchment that is being used to write on, in a way that the other commentaries haven't. So now there's a metaphor around ink as well as parchment.
Yeah, so we're definitely focusing in on a different emphasis of the Mishnah that we're dealing with. Fiona, then Sarah.
I think it means now, the emphasis, as you say, has shifted. It seems to me that the person receiving Torah is the parchment, and the way they live their life is the form that Torah assumes. So it isn't actually anything until we live it.
All right, thank you. And Sarah?
In terms of the age thing, it's sort of, I don't know, it's probably wrong. Just suggesting that if learning Torah keeps you young, because it's now as if you're writing on new parchment, and you have become, it's the learning of Torah that is keeping you young, like the child in the very first one.
All right, I really, really like that. I had not thought of that at all, but I love it. So thank you for sharing that. I think the other possibility is that we're completely changing our understanding of scraped parchment. And if we understand scraped not as meaning like reused parchment, but more as maybe battered, weathered, ways that we might just crumpled, ways that we might describe the parchment. So in fact, we're always dealing with something blank, but of course, the blank paper you're writing on still affects the way the words come out. Writing on toilet paper is very different to writing on printer paper, is very different to writing on vellum. And actually, maybe what is changing is the nature of the paper that each person, as they learn Torah, is writing on, is going to change the way that the Torah ends up looking. And the Torah is going to assume the form of the paper it's written on, and that paper is itself the life experiences. Yes, Pete, please.
So I find the use of the imagery of the golem really interesting, because a golem itself is activated by the parchment and the writing of the intention that is written on that parchment. And so there's almost this transformation from something which is very abstract and very base into something which has a form and has a purpose.
Yeah, completely. And that use of golem imagery, I wonder if it's also kind of ironically symbolic to what we're dealing with, because it's fun, child-friendly imagery almost. Like the golem, he's not just saying that knowledge is abstract until it's put into practice in a way that we might find in an education journal, which is interesting enough. But the golem, this is really bringing it to life, quite literally. And I wonder if this is actually an illustration almost of how Torah is brought to life in the imagination of each person who hears it. When we read the word golem, we're all picturing a golem. And we're doing it because someone came up with that idea as a new idea. Yes, Fiona.
Right, well, the golem was made from mud, like Adam was made from mud. And the word is Adam, which is earth. And it was only by writing the holy name of God on the golem that it sprang into life. And maybe if we are the parchment, we only spring into life when we interact with Torah, as if we're the parchment that's written on.
All right, so that's really interesting, and that fits quite nicely with Sarah's as well. That actually it's the learning of Torah, the activation with holy text that almost brings us to life, or brings us back to life, or begins our life, or however we might put it. So these are all of the traditional commentaries that we're going to look at tonight. We've got one more modern commentary that I'm going to move us on to in a moment. But before I turn the page, I'm really interested to hear how people's thoughts have changed now about whether we can understand our Mishnah as being flattering or unflattering about the aging process. Have you heard anything that has enabled you to reread the Mishnah in a way that has changed your thoughts about it? Go on, Fiona.
Right, well, I'd be like many of you, I've thought it was a bit rude and derisory about old age at the beginning, but now that we've talked so much about what we have acquired over our lifetimes to become older, and how that helps us to interact with Torah, I think we come out top, really. I think we've done it, chaps. I think we've justified our existence as old people learning Torah.
Thank you, Fiona. Go on, Norman.
Fiona just said it for me. Yeah, absolutely.
So the modern commentary we're going to look at is by an Orthodox woman teacher who was teaching children in particular in early 20th century Poland. She's called Sarah Schenerer, and she is credited with founding of a kind of like really large drive to get Orthodox children learning Torah in a relatively modern setting. She's, of course, the most recent commentary we're looking at, and of course the only woman as well. And she's the only one who we know was actively working with children in a modern educational setting as well. So what she has to say is going to be really interesting to us. Who would like to read this final one?
Please. A youth is loud, exuberant with noise and assertiveness, and this is to their credit. Ink written on new paper. This truly is the essence of youth. Older people, on the other hand, do not shout or make noise, yet they are deeply, deeply infused with ideas. Ink written on old paper, although the writing is hard to read, the ink is nonetheless embedded firmly in the paper. This is something which young people need to learn from the elderly.
Thank you. And what Sarah Schenerer has done here is she's brought a really, really important idea. Thank you for your applause there, Fiona. She's brought the really, really important idea of reciprocity. And actually, I was being unnecessarily combative by asking you kind of who came out on top, because of course, life is not that simple. And I was being deliberately provocative because the fact is we all need each other. We need older people to be literate in Torah, if only to teach the young. For their own sake, it's really useful as well, but to teach the young as well. But we also need young people to be literate in Torah because they help inspire older people as well. I'm constantly learning from the children that I teach and work with, and anyone who teaches, I'm sure, has had similar experiences. And another Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, I can't remember whether it's one that we've had already or one that's still coming, is the idea that I've learned a lot from my teachers, I've learned more from my colleagues, but the most of all, I've learned from my students. And I think that's an idea that Sarah Schennerer is really bringing forwards here. There's also a little verse that she's alluding to, and I'm sure it's a deliberate allusion. Can anyone think what I'm thinking of? I'm thinking of the verse from Joel, and the old shall dream dreams and the youth shall see visions. And that is, of course, a really powerful verse because it's underlining the fact that everyone in society has a contribution to make, but that contribution is different in context, and that young people see visions, are loud, exuberant with noise and assertiveness, they're pushing forward, and older people are there to be inspired, but also to be able to share the benefits of their wisdom and to some extent to operate as a break, which I don't mean in any sort of negative way at all, but that balance between different groups in society is what's absolutely vital. So what do we think of this final interpretation? Has she managed to tie everything together, or is she undermining what we've had? Go on, Ronnie.
I love this. I absolutely love it because she does tie everything together. There are advantages to youth, there are advantages to age, but this acknowledges much more than some of the previous commentary acknowledged it, but this acknowledges the complexity of the older mind, the older spirit, deeply infused with ideas. And although the writing is hard to read, the ink is nonetheless embedded firmly in the paper, which can be read two ways. I mean, you know, the old are sometimes accused of being too set in their ways, but it's which young people can temper with their exuberance and their loud noise and assertiveness. But this acknowledges that there is a positive interplay that is possible between the generations, and she says it so beautifully. Maybe it's because the language seems more modern, I don't know, but this is almost poetic to me.
Thank you. Yes, Janet.
I was just thinking, the last bit says to me, you know, although the writing's hard to read, the ink's nonetheless, it's firmly embedded, and the young need to learn. I think that's about needing to learn the value of having to make the effort. So you have to make more effort to read it, but what's there is still worth having. And, you know, particularly the first quote when you were talking, you know, the young and the old learning. I mean, the older brain is as capable as learning as the younger one. It just takes a lot more effort. So I think, you know, reminding the young that it's effortless when you're young, but when you're older, you put in the effort, but you get the payback.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think actually that note of perseverance that she's put in there is a universal one as well. She's saying it's harder to read the writing on old people, but actually we need to persevere and listen and teach and share because everyone benefits from that. But actually, I think there's a little subtext that that young people take a certain degree of perseverance as well. They're noisy, they're assertive, they're bloody annoying sometimes, actually. And I'm sure as someone who was involved in youth work, she would have been familiar with that idea, but actually they need perseverance as well. Every different strata in the age range that she's dealing with, they have pros and cons if we're going to reduce it to that. Young people, really easy to teach, bit over exuberant, bit cocky maybe. Older people can be much harder to teach or to reach, but they have a reserve of wisdom and ideas and life experiences that infuses who they are. And so ultimately what we found is that this idea of parchment almost is not the right analogy at all. And I think it does come back to the ink. And that's why I think actually Midrash Shmuel, the one who was focusing on the ink, was particularly important, because what we're finding is everyone is writing with ink. And the way that writing comes out varies widely from age to age, but also, of course, from person to person. We all have different handwriting. We all have different levels of literacy come to that. But the fact that everyone has the ability to put pen to paper, to put ink on paper, and to inscribe something there is ultimately the educational message that I think we're being given by Elisha ben Abuya. And just to close, I want to focus in a little bit on who he was, who gave us this very first quote. Let's find where we were. Elisha ben Abuya. Does anyone know who he was? Because he's not just any old rabbi in the Mishnah. Go on, Juan.
Yes, it's can't remember. He's contemporary of Meir, Rabbi Meir, or I'm not sure how is the relation. Is there or contemporary with Akiva, or one of them who is a student of who? Maybe Meir is contemporary or a student of Akiva, can be. I can't remember. But what I know is that it's the one that is called Aher, and Rabbi Meir used him a lot in commentaries and things. Related. Even I remember one of something about Shabbat, that Elisha ben Abuya Aher is going in a horse, showing the limit of the city or something like that. I don't know if probably you remember it better. So
yeah,
that appropriate sometimes regarding certain rules or of the halacha. I'm not sure if I'm correct. That's what I
so
remember.
Elisha ben Abuya was a rebel. He was more or less expelled from the rabbinic fellowship. He was almost de-rabbied for rebellion of various sorts. He was considered to be a heretic. There's a wonderful scene when he was teaching in the Beit Midrash, reported in the Talmud, a scene where he was teaching in the Beit Midrash, and he kind of like moved his arm slightly and Greek books fell out of his cloak. He'd been hoarding Greek works of literature, which were absolutely forbidden. And the only person who acts favorably towards him in the Talmud is Rabbi Meir, who was his student. And Rabbi Meir remains very respectful to him, not overly so. He acknowledges that his teacher has crossed some sort of line, but Rabbi Meir would still listen to him. Rabbi Meir would go to learn from him, go to talk to him. And I wonder if that actually is a little bit key to what we're dealing with here. Elisha ben Abuya is saying, more or less, that everyone has something to contribute. And I think that means, first of all, him as someone who was expelled from the fellowship, the Greeks as people who were considered beyond the pale by the Jewish community. Elisha ben Abuya wanted to learn from the Greeks. He wanted to read their parchments as well as Jewish parchments. But also, this teaching clearly had an impact on his student, on Rabbi Meir. And it worked because Rabbi Meir did not abandon his teacher for as long as they both did live. And I think that probably means actually that the emphasis on the value of older people that Sarah Schennerer identified may well have been what Elisha ben Abuya meant. Because ultimately he said something to Rabbi Meir, he taught his student something that meant that that student stuck by him no matter what he did wrong later in life and no matter how difficult it became to maintain that relationship. So we've taken a big journey through some texts that were deeply unflattering to older people through to a much more nuanced understanding of what it is to be learning at all different stages of life. And I'm really happy to have been able to share this with you during the Omer, which is a period when we're all learning together. And all of this was something that I learned as well. I did not read this Mishnah once in my life until I knew I was going to be teaching something on chapter 4, and I thought it was interesting and I delved into it. And that's something that anyone is able to do at any stage. And that is the beauty of being able to engage in lifelong learning. So thank you all so much for being here. It's been lovely learning with you. And I wish you an enjoyable rest of Pirkei Avot as you go on these next 3 weeks.